Hello and welcome back to another episode of Homebrew EDH. This is episode 56. This is a brand new deck, Voja, Jaws of the Conclave, recently winning the newest Game Nights episode and with another more recent upping the average from EDH rec. This commander just came out with Murders at Karlov Manor. It's 2 red, green, white, so 5 mana for a 5/5 legendary wolf that does everything I could ever want a commander to do. It's got Vigilance, Trample, and because that wasn't enough, we give it Ward 3. And if that wasn't already bad enough, whenever it attacks, we get X+1/+1 counters on each creature we control, where that is the number of elves, and we draw a card when it attacks for each wolf we control. So right now this deck is kind of a split for elves and wolves. It just kind of ramps hard, gets out a bunch of creatures, turns everything into every creature type, so I get all the benefits with a couple of fun cards, and then just kind of tries to beat face and win games from there. So without further ado, let's get into the ramp, the card draw, because we didn't have enough already, and everything else to go along with it. Alright, so first up, like I said, we have ramp and card draw, because I wanted more in a deck that already does a whole bunch of that. So we've got pretty much staples deck for this section. Rampant Growth, Kodama's Reach, Nature's Lore, all find us various lands, and then Thrill of Possibility, Big Score, and Seize the Spoils there. We do have to discard a card for those, but we do get treasures out of 2 of them and then 2 cards for each one. Nice and simple, on to the next best thing. Next up is our elves and our wolves. There are probably twice the amount of elves that there are wolves in this deck, just because the elves are a lot easier to find, and most of the wolves just aren't that good. So I got a couple of decent ones for this deck and just kind of said, okay, good enough, and we'll kind of go from there. So elf-wise, these are just some of them. Obviously, like I said, there's a lot more than just what we're seeing here, but Tireless Provisioner is an absolute powerhouse of a card in basically every deck I've ever put it in. So it has landfall whenever we put a land into the field under our control. We get a food or a treasure. I almost always go with treasures. Fyndhorn Elves, just like your standard Elvish Mystic or Llanowar Elves, just taps for a green. And Elvish Archdruid is a 1 green for a 2/2 elf that gives our other elves +1/+1 and taps to add a green for each elf we control, which can kind of add up here and there, especially with like a Masquerade Nexus or a Mirror Entity, but we'll get into those later. As for the wolves, like I said, most of the wolves in Magic, at least, generally aren't super good. Now the werewolves, that's a whole nother story, but we're specifically looking at wolf creature types here. I picked out a couple of decent ones for this deck, but for right now we've got Immerwolf, Inara, Wolvid Familiar, and Bounding Wolf. Immerwolf is a oldie but a goodie. Not really a goodie anymore, but maybe it used to be. 1 red-green for a 2/2 wolf with Intimidate. That means it can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or creatures that share a color with it. So if you have a blue creature, too bad. Other wolf and werewolf creatures we control get +1/+1, and non-human werewolves we control can't transform. We're not worried about that at all. It's just here to buff our wolves. Inara is a 4/4 for 4 that, as long as it's our turn, gives our Voja indestructible because it needed more help than having Ward 3 and Vigilance and Trample and all that other crazy nonsense. And another one, just a kind of more standard wolf, is Bounding Wolf. It's 2 and a green for a 3/2 wolf with Flash, and for some reason Reach. I guess it's because it's bounding, it's jumping. Maybe it can jump, 18 feet high and snatch a bird or a griffin out of midair. I don't know, something like that at least. The next 2 sections I'm going to talk about here are cards that care about the +1/+1 counters, as well as some protection cards just to keep Voja and our board around a little bit longer. For the counters, we've got Lae'zel, Kami of Whispered Hopes, and Ajani the Great-Hearted. Lae'zel is if you put 1 or more counters on a creature or planeswalker you control, or on yourself, apparently that's a thing, you can put that many +1 of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent instead. Kami of Whispered Hopes says if you would put 1 or more +1/+1 counters onto a permanent you control, that many +1 +1/+1 counters are put on instead, and then it taps for mana equal to its power. And then Ajani the Great-Hearted just gives our creatures Vigilance, which can be really helpful considering we are a combat deck. +1 to gain 3 life, and the -2 puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, and loyalty onto each other planeswalker, but we're not worried about the loyalty there, really just there for the counters, kind of like everything else. As for protection, I don't have too many in here, but just a couple of cards that I felt might be a little bit slept on. Maybe not. I don't really know how many decks these are played in. I didn't research it, and I don't really care to. Gaia's Gift, which I actually have a short on as a card that was potentially slept on. I still think it is, but maybe that's just me. It's 1 and a green for an instant, gets a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, gets reach, trample, hexproof, and indestructible until end of turn. So not only is it protection, it can give you that extra point of damage, as well as trample if you don't have it already, but in our case, Voja has trample. So really just the indestructible and the hexproof, and I guess the reach, if it comes down to it, could be super useful there. Dauntless Escort is 1 green-white for a 3/3 Rhino Soldier. It doesn't quite fit the theme, but it is a board-wide protection from like destroy effects, so a Wrath or a Blast Act or something like that. We can sacrifice it. All of our creatures get indestructible until end of turn. And Tamiyo's Safekeeping, which I think is like just the better version of Gaia's Gift, basically. 1 green mana for an instant. Target permanent you control gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, and you gain 2 life. Just a slightly better version. Doesn't give necessarily the counter or the keywords, but it is target permanent and not a creature. So if you want to protect like a, I don't know, aggravated assault or something like that in this kind of deck, you can do that with Tamiyo's Safekeeping as well. And last but not least, my favorite cards in the deck, and or basically the most useful for keeping on the game plan of getting all the creatures out and hitting face. We've got Maskwood Nexus and Mirror Entity, as well as Aggravated Assault and Rising of the Day, most of which I talked about earlier, but we'll go a little bit in depth for the cards in specific. So Maskwood Nexus to start is a 4 mana artifact that just says creatures you control are every creature type. Same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. It also, we can pay 3 and tap to make a 2/2 Shapeshifter with Changeling, which makes it every creature type anyway. Mirror Entity, that one's a little hard to read. It's the Time Spiral Remastered version. So it's 2 and a white for a creature Shapeshifter with Changeling, so it is every creature type. And it basically has an activated ability to create a Maskwood Nexus type effect. So we can pay X, and says until end of turn, creatures you control have base power and toughness XX and gain all creature types. So it's a temporary Maskwood Nexus type effect, but it also sets your creature's power to base stats. The upside to that is the counters that we get from Voja with the elves stay on there. So even if you set them to like 2/2s, if you've attacked with a bunch of elves and they've got like 4 or 5 counters on them, they're 7/7s. So we can always make use of that if we need to. And they'll get bigger on attack anyway because they'll be all the creature types. So there's always that. Aggravated Assault I did mention earlier to get extra combats in. It's 2 and a red for an enchantment that just has the ability to pay 3 and a red, so 5 mana to activate. Untap all creatures you control. If it's a main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. Activate only as a sorcery. So I ran this deck probably 3 or 4 times yesterday at my weekly Magic night. I'm recording this the day after. And that would have been super useful because I had a bunch of just open mana that I was not really doing anything with. To be fair, this deck has not been like super optimized or anything of that sort. It was just kind of a rough draft just to see how the heck it ran. Even in a not great form, getting all the counters and drawing that many cards is just good. So yeah, the extra combats might give it that extra edge that I need to actually get a win with it. I'm currently 0-3 or 0-4 with it right now. Almost got there with one game, but didn't quite get there. The last enchantment for today is Rising of the Day. 2 and a red for an enchantment. Creatures you control have haste, and legendary creatures you control get +1/+0. So it gives our Voja a little bit of extra power. Not that we actually need it or anything, but just in case. Really just there for the haste because I couldn't think of anything better and I knew I had one sitting around. Alright, and with that, today's episode does come to a close. Thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoyed, go ahead and leave a like, consider subscribing. It helps grow the channel and is the best way to currently support me. Full deck list will be in the description as usual. Tomorrow I've got a very different video coming. I'm about to sell about 315, 320 cards to a vendor friend of mine to afford the rest of my Corvold EDH deck list. Once that deck is fully done, I will make a full deck tech video on that as well. So tomorrow's video will just be me going through all 300 some odd cards just to document that and maybe look back in the future at what I was doing at the time. So that's all that's there for. And I've got another deck tech coming soon, probably Saturday or Sunday, depending on what the days look like. So keep an eye out for that one. I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care until then, and have a good one.